I grew up in Central Texas in a small town outside of San Antonio. The neighborhood I grew up in, it's like a small town called McQueenie, and then that is outside of another slightly larger small town called Seguin, which is next to a small city called New Braunfels, which is halfway in between Austin and San Antonio.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. I don't know if I ever told you that I was born and raised in Texas, like a little small, same exact thing, a small town called Pampa, which is outside of a slightly bigger, smallish town called
Mm.
Amarillo. So, so I
Oh,
get
okay.
that whole layout. Okay, go
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. And then let's see. So grew up there, moved to Tucson um when I was 15, and then stayed in Tucson through college. Graduated with my bachelor's just last May. Um Later than most people do, get their bachelor's due to I was working full time and I had a small career as like in culinary, so as a chef, a cook, and then a chef. And then I decided to go to school, and then graduated. Now pretty much moved up to Phoenix, and now I'm working my current job, and it's going pretty well.
Okay. Well, I happen to know what your current job is, and that's some hard work.
Yeah.
Quite the change from culinary. Um,
Yes.
I mean, culinary is like over in right field, and you're like not even in the stadium with what you're doing now. Well, so there was a couple of things about you, and first was what's the commonality that you and I had didn't know our parents or my father, your parents.
Mhm.
But really, what there was two other things that sparked my curiosity and my interest was your ethnicity and your general at the time lack of interest in
Mm.
pursuing that. Um, tell people what your ethnicity is.
Okay, cool. So I was born in Siberia, Russia, after the fall, well, in 1995. So I am Mongolian and northern like Asian like tribe. So Mongolian.
Okay, so Mongolian.
Hmm.
And that struck me because you don't meet many Mongols or Siberians from Texas. That's
That's a
not
bit of a that's
not
a
a
bit of a
combination you're going to
stretch.
run into.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bit of a one of a kind.
in in your journey, before we get into the other stuff, tell us about your journey from Siberia to Texas.
All right. Well, I'll tell the story that my mom tells people, and then she tells it very well. My older brother was born in 1992, and then my parents wanted a second child, but then so they were trying for a second child, but unable to due to fertility issues, so non-fertility. And then the doctor recommended that they adopt, and then so their doctor helped them get in contact with an adoption agency, who at the time was working with Russia to adopt Russian kids into the United States. And then, as far as I'm aware, this was to increase positive political ties between the two countries. And
Well, just as an aside, we know now that that was exactly the purpose because Russia has since outlawed it.
yes, yes.
Now you
Hmm.
can't adopt a Russian born child from Russia. They've out, like literally it's against the law there now. So
Yeah.
we know that it was kind of an olive branch between the two
Hmm.
countries.
Yes.
So you were part of that.
Hmm.
Go on.
Essentially, this is between the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and Putin being elected president of Russia. So I think the president's name at this time is Boris Yeltsin. It was Yeltsin, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was an initiative between the United States and Russia to get increased political ties. And so the adoption agency pretty much had pictures of Russian babies and then showed them to my mom. And then my mom pretty much picked out my picture and then said, let's adopt this one, me. And then, so the adoption agency pretty much set up travel for her and my dad to Russia and then to come see me and really decide if they wanted to adopt me. And so the flight took them from, I believe they flew out of Dallas to Georgia to, well, one of the European countries. Um, and then from that country to Moscow, where they met a contact who my mom said that this contact gave her the vibes of being like a special agent, very like friendly and but very with a background you knew he was like military
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something in the government, right?
right.
And funny thing is, she said he actually, now seeing me grown up, um, she said that this looked almost exactly like me, like for a very striking resemblance to me.
Okay.
Honestly, it was probably just like coincidence, like another Asian guy or whatever, in Russia. But so pretty
But she's in
much,
Moscow now.
yeah, she's in Moscow, at the airport there, and then this guy pretty much greets them, and then you know, with no like um bravado, was like, oh, hey, just like, hey, you're the Roederers, okay, great, I'm this, okay, let's go, and then rush them into uh like a car, like a very nondescript car, and then pretty much drove through the streets of Moscow. She said, and I quote, like James Bond,
I was gonna say
through
like a Jason
Moscow.
Bourne movie.
Yeah, exactly. And then to like a private airfield where they got onto a private um airplane and flew 12, 14 hours from Moscow to Abakan. And then she said with a bunch of drunken Russians. So I don't
Well,
know if they're
okay,
military. I don't know if they're military with this guy or whatever, but she said there was a bunch of Russian guys on there getting drunk.
okay.
And then
So let me ask you this. So you say Abu Khan, like we would say Phoenix or Tucson. Do you have any sense of where Abu Khan is relative to Moscow and Siberia?
so yeah, Moscow is, well, on the European side of Russia, um, west of the Ural Mountains. Abakan is the capital of the Caucasia region in Siberia, about a 14-hour flight or so from Moscow. Yeah, they flew to Abakan's the capital city of that region, and then they flew there, and then again, this guy like drove them around the city like James Bond, and then essentially acted as their personal tour guide and bodyguard. And because she said when they landed in Moscow, there was a very like hostile attitude towards them. Like they really stood out, even in Moscow. You could tell that they were foreigners, American. And so there was a very hostile attitude towards them, she said. And then that got worse when they got to the city where I'm from, probably because just a smaller local population. So this guy pretty much again drove them through the city like James Bond to like the hotel they were staying at, and then they pretty much stayed there till the next day when this guy picked them up again and then took them to the orphanage where they could see me. The nurse there handed me to my mom, and then she said she knew instantly that yeah, this is the kid we're going to adopt. And then apparently I was so happy to, be held by someone that I started crying or giggling or whatever, just making noise, and then I peed all over her,
Oh,
apparently.
nice.
'Cause
Well done. Hi,
yeah, I
this
wasn't
is
wrapped in
me, and
anything,
this
so
is my wee wee. I'm weeing all over
yeah,
you now. Hello.
yeah, yeah. So that was a core memory for my mom, I guess.
How
I
old
don't
were
remember
you?
it. Like 2.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you spent 2 years in an Siberian orphanage, or what was your situation up until you were adopted?
Well, I only know what the adoption records say happened to me, and what they say happened to me is that I was born somewhere in the early hours of December 22nd, and then someone found me and took me to the hospital. And then in the hospital, I was pretty much put on essentially life support for about 6 months, or about 4 months, and then I was taken off life support, but still kept in the hospital for another 2 months. And then, in September of that year, I was released to an orphanage, and then I ended up back in the hospital and then back in the orphanage. And then, spent from a year old to, 2 and a half in the orphanage, in their special unit for disabled children, or, like, special ed children, essentially, because that unit or that area of the orphanage got better care. The other children, apparently the orphanage was worried that the other children would either, like, bully me or, like, other stuff, towards me like an infant. So that's why they kept me in that, like, special unit of the orphanage. So that's pretty much, like, how my story from being born to, being up to adopted. But the thing is that I was born in an apartment building, or a hotel, or, like, no, it was an apartment building, and then just left, like, in a brown bag. And then it was the
Wow.
neighbor that found me, or someone who worked there that found me, and then took me to the hospital. And then the hospital diagnosed me with several things. It was mainly developmental things, so, like, 3rd
So
degree,
failure to
like,
thrive because you had
yeah,
no care at that point. So
yeah,
okay. So nothing that was quantifiable, but things that were just as a result of lack of being cared for in
yeah.
you in
So,
your
like,
early stages.
yeah, so, like,
Okay.
malnutrition, slight premature birth by, like, a couple weeks, I think, which probably in that region of the world is usually a death sentence, but, I survived. And then so, yeah, like, 2nd degree, like, unknown or whatever mental retardation. The 3rd degree, like, what was it? Like, height deficiency and weight deficiency. Just for, like, that age. I think I think they probably said that, like I said, so I would get better care, whatever better care was available there. I don't know about, like, high deficiency though. I'm sure, because malnutrition in, like, the first 2 years of an infant's life is, like, really bad on their, like, height development and all that. But, as far as, like, my mental capacity, I'm all there. So,
Right. Well,
um,
well, here's what I having met you and knowing you in person, I would say that your capacity intellectually is super normal. Um, and a lot of kids suffer from failure to thrive. Here
mhm,
in the United States, premature birth, all the conditions that you named, those are things that could be a death sentence here too. But I do know that if you make it through those things, depending, I mean, some children there's all kind of complications, a cerebral palsy,
mhm,
things like that. Your lungs aren't developed fully, and you can
mhm,
get pneumonia. Things like that can happen, and if they don't kill you, severely impede your development. But I mean, you may just be short because you're short, and that may just be part of the gene pool. And
mhm,
but I don't. Having met you, I think that what strikes me the most about you is how you carry yourself. You don't carry yourself like a kid with any kind of a complex. You're
mm,
not. Your ego doesn't seem inflated, as i.e. Little man's complex. But you are not. you don't seem self-conscious when you seem like a guy who's very comfortable with himself. As
Mm,
you should be, obviously, but because you've overcome a lot. And that's really what I want to talk about is you told me this part of your story and how you came to be where we were and your journey up until then. It struck me all the stuff that I had perceived about you before was based in like real stuff. Like I said, you know, you are essentially a manager in a huge company. And yeah, you're probably the smallest guy by stature on the floor. But you don't walk
mhm,
around with a chip on your shoulder and you do your job well. And knowing that you came from a background where none of that could have been. You could have, we've all seen the guy, the little man with the big man with the complex, who's has an inflated sense of self. And we've also seen a guy who came from hard times who really doesn't know how to be an authority, to be a touchstone for other people. So once you told me your background, I was like, wow, that's really interesting because the way that you carry yourself. One of the things that you share with me has been a source of strength for you is your personal philosophy. Now, before we go there, though,
mhm,
the catalyst for this conversation, aside from all that other stuff was really cool and interesting. But what really piqued my curiosity was when I asked you, are you interested at all
mhm,
in knowing more about your cultural story, your story? And you said, not really. I've had a good life here and I've
mhm,
had good parents, so I'm not really interested in that. And I
mhm,
said, whoa, because to me, and again, I'm sure there are other parts of the world where they probably have a enormous Siberian, Mongolian, Northern Asian population. Here in the United States, I can honestly say I've only met one person from Siberia ever, and that was you.
yeah,
And and being African American and having lost, aside from not knowing, you know, for many years my biological father, just losing, having so much of our culture intentionally erased. Um, it's always interesting when someone who comes from a cultural background that is even more rare is like, man, it's not that big a deal if I know anything. But then, so when I asked you about that, I was like,
mhm.
why? You gave me an answer and tell me why you at that time were not interested.
Well, the answer at its whole is pretty multifaceted. But the answer I gave you was that I was simply not interested in it because I've had a good life here growing up in America. It's had its bumps in the roads just like anyone's life, but overall, compared to what it would have been in Russia, assuming I had somehow survived the orphanage, the difference between what my life could have been versus what it is now, it's night and day. So I'm just simply grateful for that, all the time. And then I don't dwell on what could have been. So,
Okay. But since we had that conversation, you've become interested in it more or less, to a degree. Again.
mhm.
Okay, so tell me about the rebirth of that interest, the resurgence of that interest.
Well, first I was like, from the beginning, I was super interested in it because I felt lost. Graduating high school and trying to find my way in the world, I felt lost, didn't know who I was, didn't know where I come from. All I have is like some super flimsy documents from Russia that, gives a brief outline of
Can
my
we
history.
can we I want to interrupt you a little bit
Mhm,
because there is a background to how you came to feel like a fish out of water. Like
Mhm,
you were raised in this, you know, white Midwestern family. You have an older brother and a younger sister, and you said that you never really felt, the bite of racism. You lived in a small town and everyone pretty much accepted you. But then as you got older, things started to change a little bit, and then you started to become more aware that there was
mhm,
more to your story that you were interested in. Tell us about that.
mhm. Right. So growing up, you know, in a small town, everyone knows each other pretty much. You grow up with the same people, and then pretty much go through grade school with the same people. So you grow up together, then everything's fine. So I was probably the only Asian person in my elementary school, and I hadn't seen another Asian person until, well, at least at school, until like middle school. So like eighth grade, seventh grade, and then I didn't really think about it at the time. I'm like, "Oh, here's an Asian person," and then, like, we spoke and everything, and then I guess got along well. Well, there was 2, one was from China, one was from Vietnam, and then, they're cool kids, and then so we got along great. We all played tennis, so that was something in common we had. We were on the tennis team together. Um, and then, yeah, so but again, like, no one was, like, really racist towards us or like, even made like any like super, Asian jokes or anything, like even
So
just
you
like joking around towards
identified
us.
even at this time as an Asian man, as an Asian American man.
Oh,
Did
me?
you see yourself as an Asian American man, or did you see yourself just as a white kid who happened to look Asian? Did you have any?
That's a good question. I didn't identify myself as Asian or Asian American, but I also knew that I wasn't white or Caucasian. Um, and then so seeing like other Asian kids, like we got along well together, but then they try to like, have conversations with me, and then they'll be like, "Oh yeah, our Asian mom or whatever, like our tiger mom or something." I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about," and then they're like, "What do you mean?" And then I told them I'm adopted and my parents are white, and they're like, "Oh," because they're second,
Right.
their parents emigrated from China and Vietnam, so then they're like, "Oh, so you can't really relate to what we're trying to talk about." So they just dropped it. And then they didn't really bring up like stuff like that again. And then, we're still friends, so it was cool. But yeah, so it's like I never identified as Asian American, never really identified with my Asian side. I just sort of accepted that like, I'm Asian, but that's it. I don't know anything
Yeah.
beyond that. So I have to
Yeah.
continue living. So I never thought about it. I never let it bother me. I think a part of that why I was, like, so nonchalant about it, is because my mom was pretty nonchalant about it. Anyone who, she met, well, not anyone she met, but anyone that, would have, you know, prolonged contact, so to speak, with us, so say, like, our family doctor, my teachers, our realtor when we sold our house, stuff like that, like my
Yeah.
gymnastics teacher, my tennis coaches, stuff like that. My eye doctor, they would all ask, like,
Yeah.
you know?
Where did this guy come from? Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So they would ask, like, "Oh, like, is Philip yours?" Or is like or and then my mom would be like, "Yeah, he's mine." And they'd be like, "Well, how did that happen?" Then she'll go into the story about how I was adopted. And then, depending on their reaction, my mom would get, like, super in depth in, like, the first 5 minutes of, like, how, my story of being adopted was pretty much what I told you. So
Yeah.
I kinda grew up around that, like, every year, my new teacher going through grade school would ask, and then so, like, I hear it every year, multiple times a year. So I was pretty comfortable with it, and so I knew that, my mom wasn't my biological mom.
When did you catch fire to find out, so connect? to connect some dots?
Um, well, that didn't actually happen until after I graduated high school, which was in Tucson, not Texas. And then that is because I I got a job at the Ritz-Carlton as a cook. And the Ritz-Carlton has international interns, whether it's in their wait staff, or pretty much all throughout the resort, especially culinary. And so I met people from all over the world. Most people came from Southeast Asia. So the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, some people from India. I know that's not part of Southeast Asia, but and then a lot of people from Europe as well. So like I said, all around the world. And then that got me thinking, like, here are these people that look similar to me in one way or another from these other countries, and they're here. So where does that put me? Where does that leave me? And then, they would ask me like, "Oh, where are you from?" Because they automatically assumed that I was another intern. They're like, "So, oh, where are you from?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm from here." And they're like, "Oh, you're Asian American." I'm like, "Yeah, sure, I guess." And then they'd be like, "What, are you Chinese? Are you Japanese?" And I'm like, "I don't know," because at that time I didn't know. And then I was like, "I'm from Russia." And they're like, "What do you mean you're from Russia?" But you're. So then I'd have to get into it, like the details, or like as much as I care to get into it with them. Um, I think I'm pretty close with a lot of them. Like we're still friends, like on online and stuff, like Facebook, social media. And so, but that just got me wondering about, you know, where I come from, like my heritage, and also being like 18, 19, trying to find my place in the world. It's a part of the time of your life when I think most people probably feel lost, but because I didn't have like a super strong sense of identity towards a heritage or like ancestry, or like even just the knowledge where I come from, that feeling was compounded for me. And so I yeah, I felt lost. I felt empty, but I felt like it brewed into me like this sort of like energy, to like find answers in one way or another. And then the way I channeled that energy at the time was, academically, through studying, through reading as many books that I could find on East Asia, Asia, Mongolia, and then eventually ended up studying it in school. So that's like really the first time when a really strong interest, like almost a passion of being, finding out, my heritage and where I come from really started. But it was all academic, trying to piece together the puzzles through history and everything.
Did you include your mom? Like, did you tell your mom you were having this awakening?
No, no, she could probably tell, but I never really shared it with her. When I started, writing research papers on all this in school, she really supported like pursuing academia, in like East Asian studies or what, or like history, as a career. And then, so that was like on the tables for me. And then I was like super good at it. I was really good at it. My professors pretty much said the same thing. So she was supportive of it, more of a professional standpoint. She didn't know like the reasoning behind it. She just thought I was like interested in it, like I gravitated towards it.
Why do you think you didn't tell her? And I ask you because based on our conversations, your mom is stands like a monolith in the middle of your life. Like you have,
Yeah.
you cite her as the reason for so much of who you are
Hmm.
and your drive to do things. Why, when it
Hmm.
came to this one piece, did you feel reluctant to share?
I didn't think she could relate to it
Okay.
because she's pretty set in stone
Yeah.
when it comes to a lot of things. And, as far as like things like personal identity, wondering where she fits in the world, stuff like this.
She doesn't preoccupy herself with that stuff.
Yeah, she doesn't. She's a realist. Like she was retired from being a regional director for marketing at a global tobacco company. So she was a businesswoman, her career businesswoman, in sales and marketing. So, she's a realist. She was always focused on her career, where she's going next. But then she's also had like a very solid, like, grounding with her history. You know, um, she knew who her parents were. She knows her family history for generations. Small families or small areas in Texas. You can trace
Yeah,
it
yeah,
back all
yeah.
the way, right? And then so she knows her family history all the way back to like when her family emigrated and everything from Germany, I believe. And she told me that and everything. I'm like, yeah, this is great. And some of these people I know from like growing up, but I'm like, for me, I'm just like, like, okay, this is
Yeah.
cool. These people are family. This is my family since I'm adopted, but it's also like I'm sort of like brought into it. I didn't think she could really relate to like the identity crisis, the not understanding, not knowing, and the desperate sort of feeling you get when you need to know, right? And also, like, at this time as well, I was starting to read things on, like, human behavior and habits and everything and, like, how you see the world. And then a lot of what I was reading was had to do with how you grew up and influences, your behavior in the present moment, how you act, like the scripts you play out every day.
Right.
So then I was really sort of, like, terrified of the idea that a lot of what I was dealing with or how I was dealing with things, just like normal everyday things, like going to work, school. Also, on top of everything else, was what I got from what I was taught growing up by my father. And then like I never really had a whole lot of respect for my father. So then I was like terrified that this man had like so much like influence over me. I was dealing with that as well at this time. So
We haven't really talked about him, but your father,
mm,
this is your adopted father.
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Okay. And so he and your mom at some point parted ways.
Hmm.
Okay. And you had
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, not in this conversation, but in conversations we've had before, that he had an addiction problem.
Yeah, he was an alcoholic. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And so you didn't have a lot of respect for him. I just wanted to give background so that people would
Mm.
understand where that came from.
Oh
Okay,
yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. My father was an alcoholic, but he wasn't like the violent kind of alcoholic. He was more like the absent kind of alcoholic. Um, and then like didn't have a whole lot of respect for him. Um,
And you were worried that you were following in his footsteps.
at least like mentally, like I didn't
Yeah,
drink alcohol or anything.
right.
And then I stayed away from substances probably because like I just didn't want to do it because of that. But then also like my mom. Well, over time, like my mom kept painting him in like a bad light, but then also it's like from my own experience, like from what I experienced with him, he was just kind of like he didn't really had taken interest in his kids' lives, pretty much. Like he didn't care about teaching us, developing us, or anything like that. Like you would expect a good parent too, you know? He definitely seemed just more preoccupied with drinking, so while he wasn't like an abusive father, but he definitely wasn't there like when a father should have been, right? I was like, scared of the idea that, his behavior, because a kid learns, not just from like being actively taught, but also passively just through observation.
Yeah.
So I was getting, terrified of the idea that like his behavior could influence, he had passed away by this point. But his behavior could influence me in the present moment at that time, like how I acted, you know, through like reading and studying and like working on like changing my behavior. I actively tried to distance myself from that, and then finding out, learning about like my heritage, the history of the area where I was born, and so on and so forth. That was also like driven by that.
So let me ask you, um, presumably now you have shared some of your journey with your mom. And do you still think that she wouldn't understand or can't identify or has Or have you not told her yet that you've been on this kind of search? And I'll tell you the reason that I ask is because as a parent, you know, we try to give our kids a lot. We try to we want them first to feel like we are the mountain range on the terrain of their lives. Like we are
Mhm.
implacable, we are incorruptible, everything we believe is like Bible. But
Mhm.
underneath, we're really just human beings. My I don't know that my children ever seen me cry. They would tell you
Mhm.
that I'm incredibly funny, sensitive, all these things, but they've never
Mhm.
actually seen me cry. Just
Mhm.
today, my daughter almost brought me to tears. But there's always the imperative of parenthood, which is being strong, and so that
Mhm.
they can. You're like a repository of strength for your family.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but when your children rely on your humanity, now again, I don't know that this is every parent. I know that is true for me. I know that's probably true for many of my friends. Um, but I would want whatever my deal was for my child, especially a child that came to me through special circumstances, to trust that even if I can't sympathize with what you're going through, I can empathize with what it's
Mhm.
like to be a fish out of water. So that's why I ask, if you have you shared this with your mom to date, or have you just kind of been like, because I hear you, your mom sounds like, you know, Barack Obama describes his mother kind of the same way. Like she's a
Oh, yeah.
realist. His mother
Mhm.
was a realist. She's passed on, but and she was a diplomat of some sort. He describes her as like a very pull yourself up by the bootstraps, do the right thing kind of person.
Mhm.
Getting into all kind of metaphysics or having, an existential crisis didn't sound like what she was about.
Mhm.
But I think that parents like that want to be given the benefit of the doubt. I think that's
Mhm.
really what I'm advocating for your mom. But
Mhm.
anyway, I'm advocating for all parents everywhere. Actually, go on.
I love my mom, she's like the rock in my life. There's been several times where, like, I've broached the subject with her, and she's interested in it too, because she actually got my first DNA test for me for my birthday. I when I turned,
Wow.
what was it? 21, 22? Yeah. So it hadn't even crossed my mind to do a DNA test until, like, my birthday came, and then it was one of my birthday gifts from her. So, and then she was like, "Yeah, this is super interesting. We should do it, learn more about you, and then, I'll do one myself, and then we'll compare, and then we'll, like, see how our different heritages line up and everything." So, she's super interested in too. She's done the whole ancestry DNA thing, and found out about, like, her entire family history. She is interested in this sort of thing, but when I broached the subject with her, she would be receptive to, like, my questions and everything, me wondering about it, and then she would pretty much say, like, "Don't dwell on it. It's good to think about, but you have your own life to live. You can't let this take up, like, a lot of, like, your life, right? Just focus on yourself, and then, this is good to think about." Something
Yeah.
like that, right? Yeah. So it's not like she knew about it, about the interest in it, and she didn't, like, squash it. She didn't try to, and she didn't try to dissuade me from it. But she definitely kept me focused on, like, well, going to college, graduating from college,
Right. The things that are in front of you.
Yeah, exactly, my future, her message was pretty much like, "It's in the past. It's interesting to learn about, but don't worry about the past. And then, you have your own life to live and enjoy," right?
Right.
So that she's always been receptive to it and supportive to an extent.
So let's go back to, so we've established then that you went through this period, reading a lot and really kind of getting into nature versus nature internal conversations with yourself, like how much of what you learned are you acting out from this guy that you didn't respect, and then you start looking for other sources that may also act as an influence in your life, aside from your mother, of course. And
Mhm.
one of my favorite stories that you told me about your time at the Ritz Carlton was about the head chef who you walk up behind. He's this apparently, I mean, you said I think German guy, and he
Mhm.
is talking to you in perfect English. He's gets on his phone. He's talking in Chinese or something, and then he talks to the guy behind him in some other language. And you were
Mhm.
like, "That's pretty dope,"
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
And one of the phrases you used was code switching. Nobody really thinks about that. Like the ability to decode and encode different languages and all those things, everything that goes into communicating with another culture and how that affected you. Tell that story really.
Yeah, code switching, it's more of an academic term. I don't think you'll hear it much outside of linguistics. The only reason I know it is because of linguistics class I took. Yeah, this guy, I don't know if I should say his name, but he was a Michelin-starred chef who went to the Ritz-Carlton that I worked at from Guangzhou, China, and he went to Guangzhou from South Africa, a Ritz-Carlton, South Africa, and he started with the company in Berlin. And he
Wow.
grew up traveling through Europe, working in different Michelin-starred restaurants. So
Wow.
Italy, Britain, France, Spain, you name it. So this guy, I'm like 5'3". This guy's like 6'4". Yeah, looming German guy with a deep voice, definitely thick German accent. I'm cooking next to him, and he's in charge of a banquet we're doing at the Ritz Carlton. He turns to me, and apparently he has to go out and like oversee something with how it's being set up. So he turns to me and he tells me to cook the risotto, and I'm like, I didn't want to tell him, but I had to tell him. I'm like, chef, I don't know how to cook the risotto. I don't know how to cook risotto. And then I expected him to just like, because he had like a reputation for like being stern, but also like yelling when like blowing up, right?
Right, because he's
He's
German.
a chef, yeah.
Yeah, he's a chef. Right.
So I expected that to happen to me, so I was like, getting ready for it. But he was like, no, he didn't do that. Instead, he was like, he looked at me and he's like, okay, that's fine. I'll teach you. That's what I'm here for. Is to teach you things that you don't know, so that you can grow, become a chef. That's what I'm here to do, is to teach you and mentor you. So he told me what supplies to get. I got the supplies and everything, and then he started, showing me, how to cook the risotto. He did it himself first. He had me taste it. We tasted it through the process. He came up with the final product. Then he had me do it, and then he stood over my shoulder as I did it, and then this guy's like a foot taller than me, looming over
Yeah.
my shoulder. I'm like terrified, but then like he corrected me, like not in a harsh way, like very supportive. And then he was like, "Okay, you're doing good. Continue doing what you're doing. I need this amount out to the banquet in like 10 minutes." I'm like, "Okay, chef, I got you." Well, you don't say that to the chef. You say, "Yes, chef."
Yes.
And then he turns around, and then there's a Chinese intern behind us that he brought over from China because he was the executive chef in China. So he brought over Chinese interns, and one of them's behind us making mashed potatoes. At this particular event, we had like 4 or 5 different kinds of mashed potatoes. So this Chinese intern was making one of them, and then he speaks to him in fluent Chinese, like a second after talking to me in English, how to make the mashed potatoes. And then the Chinese intern's like, "Oh, hey, like yes, chef," in Chinese, and then he pulls out his phone. Apparently, he's getting a call, and then he starts talking his phone, and then he's walking outside to oversee the banquet. And then before he walks away, I just hear him start speaking German, like fluent German. He's German, and then he just walks away, and I'm like, "What the hell? What is up with this guy?" Like, I didn't know people could be like this.
Yeah.
That kind of like inspired me. I was like, I want to be like this guy, this chef who can like, he has all this amazing international experience. He speaks at least 3 languages fluently. He's able to code switch between them, but without any problems, without missing a
Yeah.
step, without missing a beat. And then he just has this presence about him, It's not that he's like a foot taller than me. If he was like smaller than me and he walked in the room, I honestly think people would like turn around, and know that he's there. So I just had enormous respect for this guy. That kind of like inspired me to like become like more of a travel internationally, work internationally, learn more about where I come from, so that I could like relate and like possibly travel there and stuff. I don't know if I'd be able to travel to Russia anytime soon, but
Right. Well, probably not. But
in the off chance that I could.
one of the things that I think about when you tell that story is how important it is your sense of self.
Mhm,
Chef was everything that he did came from a German man, a
mhm,
distinctly German person. His willingness and ability to reach across and be international stems from who he was. So
mhm,
wherever he went, whether it was in the United States, in China, in Germany, wherever it was, he took him. He strikes me as like the kind of guy that we all imagine ourselves wanting to be, like,
mhm.
the most interesting man in the world, except really the most
Yeah,
interesting man in the world.
yeah.
But it really, I think it epitomizes your journey just in terms of bringing your uniqueness to any setting, and being
Mhm,
able to be sure you are born, and I mean, you are a culturally, or I guess you're born in Siberia, but you're, Mongolian ethnically, but you were born and raised, or you were raised in Texas. All
mhm,
those are unique things that you bring into the room when you come in.
mhm,
What we're doing now is we're fleshing out the rest of it. I think it's interesting that you're hanging out with all these Asian people. You bear some similarities. We're going to get into a point here really quick once I'm done with this, because I think it's very interesting when we looked at your DNA from not the ancestry, but the other one,
mhm,
and it talks about the color of your hair and the color of your skin and the color of your eyes, even the way that people think about Eastern Europe. We all think we know what Eastern Europeans look like, and we really have no idea. For me, it's important that we build this foundation, because you are piecemeals of all these things. But there is a
mhm,
foundational you, and we've talked about this. I ask you, do you feel sometimes that you are a repository of all the things that, not the externalities, but in Eastern culture they believe in, there's filial piety, there is honoring your ancestors, there is the idea that we all carry parts of our ancestors within us. Do you, and I ask you, if you feel like you are kind of a part of something bigger outside of the United States, but from your Northern Asian heritage, do you feel like you carry some of that with you? And if so, do you know what it is, or are we still looking for that?
Overall, yes, or definitively yes, but there's caveats or layers to that yes, right?
Okay.
That feeling didn't occur naturally in me. I had to first of all, this sort of like awakening I had around this time that I knew this German chef. That sort of like was the impetus for that feeling of, I guess, a feeling of greater connection to something, bigger than myself, and that being something that I could draw strength upon and, sort of like see that in myself or like deeper within. Well, first I had to get a better understanding of like where I'm descended from. So from the DNA test that I took, and then my knowledge of history, I sort of get that feeling, that inspiration from Genghis Khan, the Mongolian Empire, and the samurai from Japan.
And so bringing that into a room, bringing greater understanding, using that as a foundation. There's some statistic, like, every out of every 116 people are related to Genghis Khan. I forget what it is. It's
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
ridiculous number, but
Yeah.
you're actually Mongolian. So,
Mhm.
so you could probably lay some claim to that realistically. But never mind that. I just think that it's possible to, because of your unique cultural journey, your ethnic journey, that it makes the story here even that much more relevant. And it brings both of those things together because, you're definitely American, whatever that,
Mhm.
you're definitely American. But
Mhm.
I can honestly say, having seen you in a position of authority, having had intellectual conversations with you, that you bring something else that is definitively not Texas, definitively not Tucson, but uniquely you. And I think that figuring out what that is and passing that on to your descendants is kind of a gift. It's an
Mhm.
opportunity. You know, you think
Mhm.
you'll have children one day?
Yeah. Mhm.
Your current girlfriend is Chinese. Just using her as a for instance, because I don't want to jinx your relationship, but your current girlfriend is Chinese. If you guys were to have a baby, would you consider your baby to be full Asian?
It's a good question. Mostly, yeah.
Yeah. So you've gotten over that hump. You are Asian.
Yeah. I think, the part of me that's European, it's only like, well, it's less than 10%, and it's made up of, a lot of the Nordic countries.
Let's go back there. You've got most of us here in the United States that have never been anywhere else. We think about Russia and we just think about Moscow, the Kremlin, and everybody there is super duper white, a little angry looking, whatever. Once you get into the stands, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, you start to see more of an Asian influence. And
Mhm.
even in you, not only is there an Asian influence, but your hair is actually light brown, which is
Mhm.
distinctly not Chinese or Japanese.
Mhm.
In either one of those cultures, they would think you were a gaijin, which I believe is Japanese for like a mixed kid.
The Gaijin is foreigner.
Oh, gaijin is a
Yeah.
foreigner.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. So,
Yeah.
but you're not. And
Yeah.
so, one of the things that you share with me about your DNA is that Europeans, Western Europeans, the color of their hair and their skin kind of trickled down from Siberia and Northern Asia into Western Europe, which I think is fascinating.
But yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And then red hair as well came from the Asian steppes. It wasn't European originally. Um, Even now, if you look at people in South Korea, some of them have red hair. It's dark red hair, but it's red hair. It's noticeably red. And then if you get further into the Asian steppes, you'll see people that look like me with red hair and light brown hair. Yeah.
So when you make the distinction between the European and the Asian, they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah, because I think it's more of an unconscious way I think about like Russia, parts of Asia, and some people would cancel me for this probably, but it comes from like the point of view of history, and particularly the history of the Mongolian Empire and how it expanded, out of Mongolia into the Middle East, into Siberia, and from the Middle East into Central Asia, parts of Central Asia, and then Russia, so Eastern Europe, and then after the death of Genghis Khan into China, right?
Where does the Golden Horde come in?
The Golden Horde comes in after the death of Genghis Khan. However, the story goes, well, pretty much written in history, that Genghis Khan he sent a scouting party north to Russia and Eastern Europe because he had heard through word of mouth from the people that he was conquering. It was along the Silk Road, which existed for millennia, for like in different iterations. That there were these wealthy people, north of where he was conquering. So he sent just a scouting party up there, not to do any war or anything, but just to see what's going on. Part of the reason why the Mongolian Empire was formed was he wanted to increase economic ties to surrounding areas through diplomacy, first of all, and then he ended up having to conquer everyone due to Mongolian culture and how they deal with beheading of emissaries.
That's pretty rough, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Essentially, Genghis Khan sent like emissaries to create trade between the Mongols that he had like unified and a kingdom in the Middle East. The ruler in the Middle East executed his emissaries and sent him back his head. In Mongolian culture, that's a big no-no. If you do that, then there's going to be retribution, and there was retribution. So Genghis Khan didn't unify the Mongol tribes and then look out at the world as something to conquer. It pretty much happened as retribution for the death of his kin in other lands.
That's a hell of a vendetta. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, he took all the known world because that's good though. That's
yeah,
good. Teaches
yeah.
them a lesson. Go ahead.
So he sent the scouting party up into like Russia and Eastern Europe. And at the time, it was Constantinople versus the Pope, and then there was France and all this other stuff. Europe was like at war with each other, like it's been for like forever. But it was after the fall of the Roman Empire, so it split into pieces and everything.
Right,
There was like the Holy Roman Empire, then there was like the Byzantine Empire, like
right.
Constantinople. The people in Russia, they're all separated, but also kind of not with like the lords and stuff. His scouting party was going through at the time what was Russia. The Europeans saw them going through their lands, and then in self defense or whatever, started just attack them, and then you attack the Mongols, and then boom.
Yeah.
So the general in charge of the scouting party was a man named Subutai or Subadai, depending on the translation. And then as far as like how the conflict between the Europeans and the Mongols started, whether the Europeans attacked the Mongols initially just attacked the Europeans out of nowhere. I'm probably getting the history mixed up, so don't quote me directly on that. But Subutai pretty much laid the groundwork for what eventually became the Golden Horde. And so they're rushing through Eastern Europe, decimating all of it, and then there's this famous story of how they reached one of the great cities and then were catapulting dead plague bodies over the walls after laying siege to it and then left. And then that allegedly led to the spread of the Black Plague into Europe and caused the Black Death.
Oh wow.
Again, that's just one story. There's multiple other stories of how it got to Europe. But it's definitely a disease from the steppes. Subutai probably would have defeated and conquered all of Eastern Europe, and then the plan was to push further west into the rest of Europe, so like Italy, France, Germany, or even more of Germany than they already done. What stopped that was the death of Genghis Khan. So when the Great Khan dies, everyone goes back to Mongolia, at least everyone that was, important to the Mongolian Empire. So the main army goes back, leaves just contingents, to maintain the empire that or the land that's conquered. And then they have the Genghis Khan's funeral. And then after that, then the Mongolian Empire split into four different empires: the Golden Horde, the Middle East, Mongolia, and then the parts of China that were already conquered. It was split between his four sons, and then I believe the son that was in charge of conquering Russia, Eastern Europe, and creating the Golden Horde was a son. I believe his name was Borte, and then so he did, and then created the Golden Horde, which ruled over Russia for like what was it, like 1,000 years, 800 years, something like a very long amount of time. The way they ruled and governed still influences Russian culture today. No one's ever going to say that. No one's going to admit it, but the brutal culture that they ruled with, conquering, others, even internally, like internal
Yeah.
politics, that came from how the Mongols ruled that area. And then so that's sort of like how I see it from a historical lens. I'm not blinded by it, like, oh no, you're all like you belong to the Mongolian Empire, and then but then that's a part of like the history that I know that you know influences like how I see everything else. So that's why, I'm probably see myself more as Asian than European. And then of course, like, I'm American, so like of course, I'm like 100% American too. So that's I grew up in America, so
we're going to have to get back together and do a part two because there's a lot of other stuff that we are leaving out. But one of the things that I want to close with was the story that you told me about the idea or the hope of going back
Mhm.
to where you were born and what that means to you and what you would do.
When I started learning about, history, my heritage, and everything after I got the DNA test, I started becoming more and more interested, and this sort of, like, was inspired, I guess, by this story of Genghis Khan, like, this great guy who's born into poverty, has nothing, has a horrible life growing up, and then rises from nothing up to, like, ruling the world, right? But he unifies his people and then returns a world conqueror, right? And then so, essentially a success, a huge success. And then so I started thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if, like, I returned to Abakan, overcoming, life's difficulties, everything, having survived in the first place, and then come back, this orphan who was abandoned, who no one thought would live, come back healthy, wealthy, success, with a family, having lived a great life. Yeah.
And bringing that back home to
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
little place in Siberia and to share with your children.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The important part is, like, having children at that point, and then that are, like, old enough to know what's going on, so, like, 5, 6, and then showing them where I was born so that they would know where they come from. And then over time, they would learn, the history and then all this other stuff. But that was like a sort of like vision or like or like, an idea I had. Yeah.
I mean, it's not one that you're going to give up on. I hope. I can say again, as a dad, we all have those superhero moments, those ideas where we share something with our kids that are going to sustain them and help them, in a world that is constantly tugging at your identity, constantly challenging you to assert your right to be who you are.
Mhm.
Obviously, the first step in that is knowing who you are, and you've already taken several steps down that road. And I'm sure that when the time comes and you have a little Philip Jr. or Philippa Jr., I don't know,
Mhm.
but I'm sure that when the time comes, you will be ready to present them with that grand vision of where you came from and how you got to be, how they came to be where they are. I mean, the
Mhm.
story is so, to me, it's very unusual and there's so much in it about
Mhm.
parenthood, about being a child raised in a multicultural household, adopting children that are outside of your culture and outside of
Mhm.
your ethnicity. I mean, I see that a lot as well, just every day. There's, the African family that adopted the white kid, or the white family that adopted the African kid, or the white family that has the little Asian kid. But yours is interesting because of your ability to articulate your journey, and also
Mhm.
you there may be Chinese, there may be Japanese, there may be African,
Mhm.
but Siberian and Mongolian, that's very unique. So, do you have anything that you like to share before we wrap it up? What I want to know, tell me about where your mom fits into the picture at the end. You gonna take her to Russia? Take her back to your spot when you're
She'll probably,
successful and
if she wants to, totally, yeah. And then, like, it'd be great to get her perspective on, like, because she's been there before, she's seen it already, and then
yeah,
she could point out, like, "Oh, I remember this. I remember, like, carrying you down this street, after we adopted you," all this, stuff. That's if she wants to go, like, traveling across the world, she's, like, 65. If she's up to it, if she wants to do it, yeah, totally. If she doesn't, I'm not going to, like, push her.
right,
Yeah,
right. But you would
yeah.
invite her.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's the most
Mhm.
you can ask for, I think. All
Yeah.
right, Phil, man, thanks a lot.
Of
Third time
course.
was the charm. Um, I will see you at the shop on
Yeah.
Sunday,
Yeah.
right? You're there on Sunday?
Yes. Yes. I'll be there Sunday. Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, you have a great rest of your weekend, my man.
You too, Curran. Sorry about the history lesson, but I got
No, are
off on
you
a tangent.
kidding?
So.
No, I mean, we're only shutting this down now because we got other stuff that we're doing. But you and I can sit around and talk about history and philosophy all
Hmm.
day. I mean, I love the history lesson. And I
Hmm.
think you made a couple of really interesting points about Genghis Khan and just I actually had no idea that he had sent emissaries along the Silk Road to build diplomatic ties, and they were murdered, and that was why he started killing everybody.
Yeah. 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 It's pretty in depth. Yeah. It's pretty
Well, I
surprising.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's a very valuable lesson. And the last time we talked, you told me that the that even to this day, the Mongolian generals are still studied by modern day generals and how they
Hmm.
attacked and did their thing.
Yeah. And then, yeah. And I was just speaking to someone at work who's a veteran, and then I asked him. I was like, if the military still teaches like, in military history or whatever, like the Mongol Empire, and he was like, oh yeah, totally. Mongolian military formations and how they're moved and everything are still studied and used today by the U.S. military. And I'm like, that is crazy.
But I mean, you don't conquer the world by accident or
No,
just
yeah.
because you're bigger or larger in number than the other group. I mean, not only do you have to conquer, but then you have to
Hmm.
govern, which
Hmm.
shows a whole other level of sophistication.
Yeah.
That I mean, it's nation building, and
Hmm.
you really don't think about the Mongols as nation builders, but they actually
Nope.
were.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, a lot of things are can be credited to the Mongolian Empire that usually isn't, um, which is crazy. Like, yeah, I could go on and on about it, but
Well, the victors get to write history,
they do. Yeah.
and they're the Mongols. I mean, to be honest, given the amount of enmity that many other cultures may have because they were just conquered by the Mongols have their legacy, such as it is, has endured pretty dang well. I mean,
Yeah.
Genghis Khan will always be in the top list of like, top generals, top rulers ever. I mean,
Hmm.
you know, they the Greeks did everything that they could in Egypt to erase any sign of previous kings and whatever. That's what countries and rulers have done for millennia. The fact that they haven't been able to erase every trace of the Mongol
Hmm.
Empire is a testament to how deeply rooted those folks are. Also,
Yeah.
again, I would encourage anybody who's never been to go to Siberia, to go to parts of Russia, and seeing people that look Asian by Western standards are not Asian at all. I
Hmm.
mean, they're
Yeah.
they're from Kazakhstan or
Hmm.
whatever it is, and it's really amazing. You know, um, so I think I've always been a believer that history is essential to
Hmm.
I think humanity.
Hmm.
Knowing how things got to be the way that they are,
Yeah.
and kind of gives you a sense of where they could go. The Mongolian Empire, like you said, is um, foundational to much of Western thought and Western nation building processes, from the conquest to the governing. You
Hmm.
know, I didn't know that the Mongols were post the Romans. For
Hmm.
some reason, I always thought that they were maybe around the same time or maybe a little pre the Romans. I didn't know that they came after the Romans.
Yeah. Well, Genghis Khan came after the Romans. During when the Romans, were a thing, um, they were at war with the Mongol tribes, believe it or not. But that was the Huns.
Okay,
So we all know like Attila the Hun from
Attila the Hun.
Mulan. Yeah. I don't know if it was Attila himself that the Romans were at war with, but every now and then the Huns would, attack Rome on horseback and just cause devastation. Yeah. And then they stopped. I think it was because of disease, but yeah. So I mean, the Mongols had like been around for a long. It's a very very old land population. So yeah.
And the Mongols were the Huns before.
Yeah, yeah. The Huns is just a Mongol tribe. Yeah, or like faction, depending on how you want to look at it. But yeah, they're from the Mongolian steppes. Yeah,
Okay, we
yeah.
would to be continued for
Um, do you,
sure.
yeah. So we didn't talk about like so we spoke about like how you know my interest in my heritage and ancestry like started, but we didn't get into like the circumstances like that like killed it.
Well,
Do you want
I
to save
didn't
that
know if
for
you wanted
later?
to talk about it because it was kind of a personal thing.
Yeah, I
I'm
think.
interested. I definitely want to
Mhm.
hear about it, and I'm sure other people will want to hear about it.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think it's important. It's
okay,
definitely important. Yeah. So
okay,
I don't know
let's
if
go.
next time you want to talk about it or
Let's
okay.
go.
Okay. So let's see. Um. Well, picking up with the German chef, he inspired me to become like this international like person of some kind, and I eventually did in one way or another. I studied abroad in Japan, learned Japanese, and then what planned to study abroad in China and learn Mandarin after that. But then COVID hit, so I wasn't able to do that. And then around that time that COVID hit, I started dating this girl. Long
The
story
girl.
short,
This is a,
yeah,
so many great stories end
yeah,
with the girl.
yeah. Long story short, she was quite emotionally and mentally abusive towards me. And then I stuck around a little too long with her and put up with it for too long. And essentially, she just like killed the zeal I had for like life and the passion I had for like what I was doing. And then at the same time, I had a very non-supportive friend group that essentially, I would tell them like I'm depressed, and then they're like, "We're all depressed. What do you mean?" And then I'm like,
Oh, great. Thank you.
"Yeah,
Thanks for that.
yeah, yeah, exactly." And then yeah, and then I'm like, "You don't tell a depressed person that, You're like, oh, maybe you should go talk to someone at the very least."
Right,
But then
right.
yeah, no, their response was like, "Yeah, we're all depressed. Get over it." And I'm like, so that didn't help. So eventually I broke up with her and then found out that I was actually clinically depressed like 2 years later.
Wow.
So for like 2 years, 2.5 years straight, I was clinically depressed, didn't know it, and then just trying to like fight my way, throughout it. The thought process was like, oh, life just sucks right now, but I'll get through it. And then essentially I just ended up going to therapy. And then like my therapist, was like, oh yeah, diagnosed me with depression, and then I was on antidepressants for like 2 weeks or a month tops, and then went to like 3 or 4 sessions of therapy, and then you know I felt so much better after that. It was crazy, but that's kind of like the spark notes of it.
Well, hold
But
on, because people need to hear the background that prior to this girl, that your experience with dating generally
mhm.
was limited.
Yeah, and looking back, I think that's more self-imposed than anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, growing up, I always thought that like, especially when you get to like high school, I had the belief, no one explicitly told it to me. I just kind of like gleaned it from something or other people that, Asian men were like less desirable or like not dateable, especially
Mm.
if they're short, you know. And then so that definitely affected like me in high school. And then looking back, and then especially with friends that I spoke with post high school, we went to high school together, about, dating, and then they're like, they told me like, "No, dude." They're like so many girls were like into you in high school. You just like walked away, and I'm like, "No." So I just didn't perceive, that I had any prospects as far as
Any
like
kind of
dating.
mojo.
Exactly. But in reality, I did. I just killed it off myself. So, I didn't have a girlfriend in high school. My first girlfriend I got while I started dating when I worked at the Ritz Carlton. She was actually Indonesian of Chinese descent, so she was Asian. And then we got along great, but then we broke up after she went. She was an intern, so she went back to Indonesia after her internship ended, and then we broke up. And then a year after that or so is when like my ideas for like my life and everything started to take off. So that's when I went back to school, or I was going to community college for the longest time, and then I transferred to university. So then that's when I transferred to university, became a chef to pay for university because I became a chef at the university that I was going to. So I got like a really good discount on tuition.
And U of A.
And yes, 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 at the U of A. So I didn't have time, to date, even have a big friend group, right? Like from that time, I don't, I'm not in contact with anyone I met during class during that time, right? I really created this like grind mindset, wake up at 4 a.m., go to work until noon, and then go to class, and then go back to work after class, and then get home at like 5 or 6 p.m., and then study until like 9, and then go to sleep, wake up at 4 a.m., and do it all over again the next day. And then I did that for years. My days off were during the week, so I only had 2 days off, and then I had them for class, so I scheduled most of my classes during my days off. But then there's there's those classes that go Monday to Friday. So yeah, I was in that grind mindset. I had like on average, it was like 16, 17 credit hours. My work's busy season was the school year. So I was working anywhere from 80 to 100 plus hours a week because
Wow.
I was like the supervisor, I was the chef, and then doing that. But I was succeeding at it, like I was like super driven to succeed and prove myself. So I had these aspirations to like go to Harvard Business School and Harvard medical school with a dual degree, create like my own medical technology company, headquartered out of Japan, like change, the medical industry. I was majoring in stuff that would let me do that. I was double majoring in business management and East Asian studies for, Japanese. I added anatomy and physiology as a minor, and then I was going to change it to a major because I was doing really well. And then I started dating this chick, and then she was just completely horrible. And then everything just went down the drain. And then I think it's just coincidental that this happened during COVID. But I think if COVID hadn't hit, the effects that would have had on me would have been mitigated because I essentially spent lockdown in this like very toxic, mentally and emotionally abusive environment, right? So the effects were compounded because of that, because I was isolated. And like I said, my friend group wasn't very supportive of me. My mom was. Like I said, the
She's your
realist.
mom.
She's like yeah, yeah. She's this girl. Just get over her and move on. And I'm like, mom,
Right.
come
Yep.
on. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But so that entire experience like really killed the passion I had for life. I ended up in the long run just graduating with one major, the East Asian Studies major. My GPA went from like a 4.0 to like 3.5, 3.6. Totally lost interest in myself. So like my history, my ancestry, and everything. I started thinking like, what's the point? You know?
Yeah. Became nihilistic.
Yeah. I was depressed. That's what depressed people think. And then when I got over depression, I kind of felt like that phase of my life was like at an end, where I'm like, I had been through this. It was just a bad relationship and everything, but it was also the COVID-19 pandemic at the same time. A lot of people have been through much worse. I know that. And I'm also not like a singular person as far as this thing goes.
But that's not the point. I mean, a heartbreak, mental health, period, mental, emotional health is very subjective. And
Mhm.
it doesn't matter what that person over there is dealing with versus what you're dealing with. What matters is that
Mhm.
you're dealing with what you're dealing with.
Mhm.
and you're dealing with it alone. And during
Yeah.
COVID, really alone and isolated.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is I think that in addition to the therapy, you adopted a whole kind of philosophy for moving forward. We talked about, Bushido and really immersing yourself in this kind of Eastern philosophy. Talk a little bit more about that.
So Zen Buddhism, it's something I started reading about back, before I transferred to university. So it's something that I like had been reading about for a while. Same thing with Bushido. I don't look at it as like a religion. It's classified as a religion, but it's depending on who you ask, it is or it isn't. But one thing it emphasizes is a focus on the present moment, mindfulness. What you're doing in the present moment, and nothing else matters. There's a saying that the past is the past; it can't hurt you. The future is not here yet, so don't let it bother you. All you have is the present, and it's a present. That's why they call it a present, right? Or the present. When I first heard that, a light bulb went off in my head. I'm like, that's right. The past is the past. It can't hurt me anymore. If it does, I'm allowing it to. I'm choosing to allow it to hurt me mentally, and I'm letting that affect me in my life. And then thing is, I told myself that like during the depressive episode, but I guess I was just like so depressed that even that like didn't help me get out of it. So if eventually, the antidepressants therapy did. But so after all of that and thinking of like, Zen, moving forward with that, that what really matters most is the present moment. I guess I garnered like a healthy appreciation for everything that I had been through, up to this point. It just made me super grateful for my life and really, along with, the passion for like finding out about my heritage being killed, uh,
Yeah,
sort of like letting it lie, being grateful for it, acknowledging it, but also just focusing on, what I'm doing in the present moment. So
right.
yeah, right.
Well, one of the things that looms large for me in your narrative is you seem to always move forward best with goals.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because any self-help or self-improvement guru, Stephen Covey, Zig Ziglar, Tony Robbins, Jordan Peterson, any of these people would say something like how goals are important. Goals are, you got to have goals, write them down, put them
Hmm.
everywhere. But
Hmm.
that is acknowledging the future and not being in the present.
Hmm.
But everything I've experienced of you in the time since we've known one another, you're goal oriented. But
Hmm.
there's never been a time that we've ever had a conversation where I ever felt like you were not present
Hmm.
and in that moment. And I
Hmm.
that's got to be some type of a skill, to be able to have
Hmm.
goals, to have a focus beyond the present, but to still be
Hmm.
present.
That's interesting you should say that because say when I was like in school, during the whole job and the school thing, I didn't think about my goals. I had like a list of goals and a timeline to complete it by. I was like, I'm going to graduate in 3 years with these 3 degrees. I'm going to work for a year and then I'm going to apply to grad school and then get into the school that I want to. And then 3 years after that, then I'll start my career, blah, 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 blah. I literally had a timeline with years and down to the month that I was going to complete things by. But that wasn't the point. Those goals, man, like were created after I had found a deeper sense of a purpose that I had in my life. And then those goals were the meaning behind them was that they would help me give light to this meaning in my life and influence the world, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's kind of like Nietzsche's saying, those who have a why to live for can bear almost anyhow.
yeah,
That yeah, that's the entire thing behind that is that so yeah, I had these goals, but achieving the goal in and of itself wasn't the point. It was like, why were these goals created and will they achieve? this greater meaning that I found for myself in my life. And then that meaning that I found for myself in my life would like actually tied back to like what I learned about my ancestry and my history and like going back to Russia with my family, making sure that orphans around the world have better access to healthcare, and education, and are better able to survive no matter where they come from. Something I kept reminding myself back when I was like in despair over like who I was is that this sort of idea, I don't remember where it comes from, that the circumstances of your life don't matter. It's what you choose to do in your life that matters.
Yep.
And then I don't know if that's like an idea from like Viktor Frankl or like something else. So that was like where all that came from, was like that greater meaning I had, which is
Yeah.
utterly destroyed during COVID and when I was like dating my ex and all that and
Yeah.
my toxic friend group. So I haven't like fully regained that.
I think, I mean, there's a couple of things that come to my mind. First is the importance of relationships in our journeys, how the people we choose to share these journeys with are essential parts,
Mhm,
of accomplishing the journey.
mhm,
Um, a, a toxic girlfriend, a supportive mom, a toxic friend group, very cool, a chef that you admire, super duper important. Also, though, is the importance of mental health. You
mhm,
know, it's it. You can
mhm,
have $1 million in the bank, you could have an IQ of 210, but you could
mhm,
be John Nash, the guy from A Beautiful Mind, and be completely crazy and have no
mhm.
peace. Mental health is majorly important.
Oh yeah.
I also think that
Mhm,
it's important for something that you said that I think I'll think about a lot is you had this perception through high school that because you were Asian, and not just you as an Asian, but all Asians were somehow undesirable. I think that's important for people that are part of the in group, whatever that means, white, black,
mhm,
Asian in some places, to understand that, we talk a lot about inclusivity, making people feel like they belong and like they're welcome. And yet, somehow these messages persist. And I mean, it didn't die because you found your mojo, you got into the world, and it still lingers. I was at an event a couple of days ago where it was myself and another African American woman. It was interesting to see how everyone around us interacted with just these two black people in their midst. And
mhm,
the messaging was not, I'm sure, not what they intended. So I
mhm,
think that that's important for people to take away from this conversation too, is we all have feelings and we all pick up, like you said, we learn passively, just like we learn explicitly. We
mhm,
learn from the things that people do to us, as well as the things that people do around us, and then sometimes from nonverbal cues, whatever it is, and how these things can affect and derail a perfectly competent human being.
mhm,
And whatever you do in your life beyond this point will be the much more because of the journey you've taken to get to this point. Before we wrap up, let's just tick them off. Born and left in a brown paper bag up in friggin' Siberia.
mhm,
Found randomly by somebody and taken to the hospital, which Siberia sounds like the hood. It sounds like one big hood. And people finding babies in paper bags and going, let me take this baby to the hospital. That's
Well,
a that's a 50-50 proposition
yeah,
on its best day.
yeah.
And then for you to actually make it through the hospital, sick, going into the orphanage, surviving and being born at a time where you had friendly relations between the two most historically oppositional enemies ever, You come along at a time when they're trying to build bridges.
Mhm.
Your mom comes over with your alcoholic adoptive father, adopts you, brings you back into a better, but another round of dysfunction,
Mhm.
only for you to still maintain this focus. You make it through all of that. You make it through Tucson. You told me some stuff about Tucson and your first encounter with racism, which is something we will have to tackle the next conversation. But it's
Oh, yeah.
really interesting. But you survive all of this
Mhm.
to get to this place here, which is not even is not a destination. It's merely a turnstile in the journey.
Mhm.
But you have been through so much just to get here,
Mhm.
which makes the goal mean just that much more.
Mhm.
I think it's an amazing story, man. And I think it makes you, if not the biggest, one of the biggest men in the room, like the chef.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
So
wow,
it's
thank
very
you.
cool,
Yeah.
Phil. If you were going to sum up your life for little Philip, when you
Mhm.
were 5 years old, beginning your journey, you met him, you were going to tell him in a nutshell what a 5-year-old could learn from his future self, what would it be?
That's a good question. One, I would tell him that your circumstances and the people around you don't have to determine who you are or your reactions. I would tell him that you have the power to choose your reaction to a situation. And then, whether a 5-year-old would be able to understand that, I don't know. But second, I would say there's great meaning in where you come from. If we're talking to me specifically at that
Yes,
time, there's great meaning in where you come from. You're not going to understand it until you're older, and you're going to forget about it for a long time. But there's going to become a time when it comes into question, and you should just know that when that time comes where you're thinking about this, take it and run with it, and don't let anyone stop you from doing that.
I like it. And what I would add to that is point number three is you are enough.
Oh yeah.
You're enough. Don't let
Mhm.
anyone ever make you feel like you're less than enough for whatever.
Mhm.
That would be my third give to 5-year-old Philip. All right, my man. That's it for the night.